Hello and welcome to another episode of Global Tantrum. I am your host, Steve Pally. With me, as per usual, is my co-host, Professor Galen Jackson. Galen, how you doing this week, buddy?
I'm all right, man. Gotta go back to my job next week and actually do what they pay me for.
Ah, you got to teach undergrads. Is that what's happening?
Yeah, I'm sort of looking forward to it this semester. I mean, I think it's probably going to be a long semester for a variety of reasons, but I'm teaching a class on nuclear weapons and a class on U.S. grand strategy. So those aren't topics you can get up for. I don't know how to help you.
We can and do. That's what we do on this podcast.
Yeah.
What have I been up to? So I've been looking at winter break for the family because here in Los Angeles, the kids get 3 weeks off, which is a blessing and a curse, mostly a curse if you don't make plans. So I'm trying to get ahead of that and plan a ski trip to our great northern neighbor, the great nation of Canada. So that's what I've been working on.
The 51st state.
Yeah, we'll see. They're not too happy about that. Maybe we'll get to that on a podcast at some point.
Yeah, we probably should.
Yeah, the US Canada relationship. It's interesting. More interesting than you'd think. We're not going north this week though, Galen. We're headed south to a country that is itself headed south. See what I did there?
These segues, man, it's an upward trajectory. It's good stuff.
I cooked that one up in the shower earlier today. So yeah, I needed to go north so we could go south. We're going to Venezuela, buddy.
Not a place I am an expert in by any means, violating my rule of being very well prepared when I talk about major issues like this. But I have to say, learning about it was very fun, and it's good to get out of your comfort zone from time to time. So I'm glad we're doing it. I would also say this seems to be a major story that, at least for me, was somewhat flying under the radar. I guess, do you real quick want to talk about what the state of affairs is and why we're talking about it?
Yeah, I'll lay out the high level. So the Trump administration has dispatched a fairly large naval and marine fighting group to the Caribbean, supposedly to interdict the drug trade out of Venezuela. There's reason to think there's a lot more going on than just that, but there's a good amount of capability. And we have the Iwo Jima amphibious assault group, which is, I think, 2,200 Marines. We have guided missile destroyers. There's apparently a nuclear attack sub in the group and another one on the way. We have electronic warfare. It's not inconsiderable.
I saw one quotation from a Defense Department official that was in the New York Times that said deploying guided missile destroyers to fight drug cartels is like, quote, bringing a howitzer to a knife fight, end quote.
Yeah, totally. So that the cartels operate speedboats and, like vessels of that nature.
Yeah.
Not so much aircraft carriers and things like that. There's no carrier in this group, but basically everything up to that. And to be clear, there's not enough there to mount an invasion of Venezuela. 2,200 Marines is not going to do it, even by our own historical standards of invading Latin American countries. That's not going to do it. We'll get to that. But the Venezuelans have reacted predictably under their authoritarian leader, Nicolas Maduro. They've called up 4.5 million militia members or something.
I mean, I saw that number is sort of soft, but 4.5 million people, even if you're off by a quarter, is an enormous number of people to deploy.
It's spurious. It's, by some accounts, 15 to 20% of the entire remaining population of Venezuela, because a quarter of the population of Venezuela is no longer in Venezuela. We'll get to that too. But suffice it to say, this is an interesting story, not because the United States is likely to invade Venezuela anytime too soon, but because it has implications in U.S. Latin American affairs and U.S. affairs with Russia, China, and Iran and Cuba. So the major autocracies and some less major ones like Cuba. And in terms of United States domestic politics. And we're going to unpack all of that for you and kind of get into it, because there's a lot more going on here than meets the eye. What meets the eye is interesting enough to begin with, but I think we need to put all of this into historical context before we get too far into it, because as I alluded to, the U.S. has a long and proud tradition when some would say infamous tradition of interfering in Latin American affairs using military force. We've been doing it for quite a while, right, Galen? And you did the historical deep dive on this. So maybe you can get into it for us.
Yeah, I mean, I'd put deep dive as like that's generous. Actually,
you're shallow as everybody else's like subterranean.
That's nice of you. In this case, I think shallow is closer to the truth. But maybe the most disappointing part of this is how much I've forgotten. I was doing some reading, being like, oh, I definitely learned this in high school and college, like the ins and outs of how the Wilson administration responded to the revolution in Mexico.
It's a deep pull, right?
I guess that's the aging process. The United States has a very long history of, I'll let people choose their words, interfering, intervening, meddling, policing the Western Hemisphere. Protecting, if you want to go with that. I'm going to start, since we're talking about Venezuela, with one thing I did have a good recollection of because it's such a critical moment in the history of U.S. foreign relations, and that's this crisis in Venezuela in 1895. Why is this important? For a few reasons, but the biggest one is this is where the Monroe Doctrine, which we've talked about before, it's not when it's inaugurated, that's all the way back in the early 1820s, but when President Monroe laid that doctrine out, which again essentially says, everyone else stay out of the United States' neighborhood. The Western Hemisphere is, it's our neighborhood and we reserve the right to police it. The Europeans sort of said, well, that's cute, because at that point, the United States was not a world power. This crisis in Venezuela is the moment when that kind of shifts. The details are not super important, although Venezuelans certainly remember this as a moment when they got screwed. But suffice it to say, there's a boundary dispute between Venezuela and the British Empire. And the territory in question takes on added significance because gold is discovered in the region. And essentially what happens is the United States tells the British, we will decide what's going to happen here. Now, ultimately, there's an arbitration that takes place and the British largely get their way. But for our purposes, the real point is the United States tells the British, this is our neighborhood and we are going to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. And a guy named Richard Olney, who was Secretary of State at the time, wrote a 12,000-page letter to London.
What?
12,000 word memo. Big difference.
Okay. That's like the entire Lord of the Rings cycle, yes, plus all the prequels and sequels.
Word, not pages. My bad.
Okay.
And the famous line is now called Olney's 20-inch gun, which read, "Today the United States is practically sovereign on this continent, and its fiat is law upon the subjects to which it confines its interposition." In other words, we call the shots here, and you have to deal with us. And the British largely go along with that. This is also kind of a moment where British appeasement of the United States begins, and many people think that ends up being successful. Less than a decade later, you get something called the Roosevelt Corollary, which, if the Monroe Doctrine is stay out of the Western Hemisphere, the Roosevelt Corollary is the United States will actively police the hemisphere to make sure that it gets his way. This is followed by big stick diplomacy, which Theodore Roosevelt was fond of using, which is essentially the shadow of military force playing a certain role in negotiations.
Gunboat diplomacy. And you could call it shadow. Often force stepped out of the shadows.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, let's get right to that. If we talked about all of the various interventions the United States has carried out in the Western Hemisphere, we'd probably be here for a while. I'm just going to name some big ones. The Eisenhower administration supported a covert operation to overthrow a democratically elected government in Guatemala in 1954. The Nixon administration did this in Chile in 1973, overthrowing
Pinochet. Yeah.
Well, they replaced Allende with Pinochet.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, not a great guy. Cuba, I think this is just, something that's been ongoing for well over half a century. Mexico is another obvious one. Obviously, the United States fought a war with Mexico in the 19th century that largely accounts for why the western half or third of the United States is part of the United States at this point.
Including where I'm standing, baby.
Yep. Reagan, I believe, in his only use of military force abroad or deployment of troops abroad in 1983 in Grenada. We talked about the Contras in Nicaragua in 1986. One that is well known that I got a sort of weird laugh out of earlier was the United States arresting a guy named Manuel Noriega in 1989 on drug trafficking charges, directly relevant for what we're talking about today. I had heard that one of the tactics that the United States used to arrest him was trying to force him out of where he was hiding by blasting loud rock and roll music. So I did a quick dive into that and found that the National Security Archive had actually come across the list of songs that the troops requested be played. And it's quite a list. We've got Bruce Springsteen, David Bowie, Boston, Blue Oyster Cult, Tom Petty, Van Halen, New Kids on the Block, Led Zeppelin, the Doobie Brothers. I just think it's pretty funny that someone filed a Freedom of Information Act to get that information.
When I heard the list, I was like, oh, that just sounds like my college fraternity basement. Like, if I'm Noriega and I'm posted up, I'm maybe having some beers, chilling out, enjoying the tunes. Anyway, they eventually got him out. Yes. By the way, they sent 30,000 troops to do this. Talk about completely overwhelming force.
Yeah.
Right? He ended up in jail on a 40-year sentence. And I think
he died in prison in like 2017. And
yeah, fairly recently.
Yeah. So yeah, that's just a brief slice of, more we could go into, but it reflects the fact that the United States actively is involved in the politics of Latin America and South America and has been for well over a century. In terms of Venezuela specifically, I found some great information on this, by the way, on the Council on Foreign Relations website, if people are interested in checking it out. I'm just going to suffice it to say for now, relations actually fairly good during the Cold War and the immediate post-Cold War period, largely because Venezuela was seen as anti-communist and generally friendly to U.S. oil interests. Venezuela, by the way, although I think it's the 12th largest producer of oil, has the largest proven oil reserves on planet Earth, more so than Saudi Arabia. That glue starts to fall apart in 1999 when one Hugo Chavez takes power in Venezuela. And here I'm going to turn it over to you because I think this is the story not only of a downward trajectory in U.S.-Venezuela relations, but also for Venezuela itself.
Yeah. So the story is called How to Destroy a Rich Country in 2 Easy Steps. And I'll get to that. First, I want to talk a little bit more about what Venezuela is and what kind of country it is. It's been independent for about 200 years. For much of that time, it was fairly autocratic. It had brief periods of democratic rule, but mostly autocratic, military dictatorships, conservative dictatorships, anti-communist dictatorships, basically controlled by large landowners. And that's the story in a lot of Latin America for a lot of the history of Latin America. Venezuela is freaking huge. So it doesn't look that big on a globe or on a map, but it's actually more than twice the size of California, which is not small at all. And you mentioned that it has the world's largest proven oil reserves. It's right here in the Western Hemisphere. What are we doing in the Middle East? It's right here. It's right here. Part of the issue is that it still has the largest proven reserves because it's been completely incapable of extracting those reserves. They've stayed in the ground because they're so bad at extracting it. And we'll get to that. A lot of it has to do with mismanagement and political instability. Now we're talking about this guy, Hugo Chavez, who comes to the fore in actually an attempted military coup in 1992. He is a paratrooper in the Venezuelan armed forces. And he's this charismatic guy who is a revolutionary socialist, kind of like Fidel Castro, left-wing guy. He tries to overthrow the government, doesn't go well, spends some time in jail, comes out and wins an election, a democratic election, as you say, in 1999, and immediately begins reforms, big ones, especially land reforms. Now, land reforms can go really well and improve things and make countries more democratic, more equal, and so on. Or they can go really badly and wreck everything. The idea for the land reform that the Chavez government instrumented was pretty good. It was to break up these large estates and sort of give them to peasants and so on to try to establish property rights and get people to invest more and work harder, produce more food. In practice, this completely tanked Venezuela's food production. Okay, that's step one in the two-step plan for how to wreck your country. Now let's talk about step two. You've wrecked food production, so food prices go way up. What do? You start subsidizing food. You start spending a lot of money to help people buy food, bring those food prices down. They need to be imports now, right? Because much of Venezuela is poor. How do you do that? Through oil sales, right? You're leaning very hard on the National Oil Company, which it goes by the acronym PDVSA. So you've got the National Oil Company. It is not particularly well run. It has been nationalized, then privatized, then nationalized again.
Denationalized, yeah.
Yeah. So you got this kind of yo-yo effect. Every time this happens, like half the experts leave, new experts come in, right? You don't have like the right parts to like fix the
or they're
pipeline.
staffed with regime loyalists who are
that goes without saying. A lot of corruption, right? Chavez is a very charismatic speaker. He's not the best administrator, and he's also highly corrupt. Anyway, you're getting enough oil out the door to be able to run these subsidies. During this point in time, under Chavismo, the government is like running grocery stores and gas stations and things like that. So you can just literally walk into a government-run grocery store, get food, and leave without paying anything. Like, kind of amazing. It's like one of those Amazon stores, right? In Seattle, except that you don't get billed, right?
Yeah.
Same goes with gas. So living standards are still okay, right? Guess what? During the global economic crisis, or actually a little bit after the global economic crisis, oil prices tank. Global oil prices tank. Yeah. They basically fall by half. This blows a gigantic freaking hole in the Venezuelan budget. And those subsidies are no longer possible, right? And this causes a series of escalating problems, to put it mildly. And at this point, Chavez is also sick with cancer. And on his way out, he basically handpicks his successor, this guy, Nicolas Maduro, who I believe is a former bus driver. Something like that.
Was that right? I mean, I think he was his foreign minister initially. And then,
he may have been at one point,
VP, but yeah, maybe. I didn't know that.
Yeah, perhaps not the most highly qualified head of state that we've ever seen in Latin America. Anyway, Chavez eventually dies. Maduro takes over and swiftly converts the country to a full autocracy.
I just want to corroborate that. He began his working life as a bus driver.
Thank you. And that's not to say we don't have very talented bus drivers. Yeah, it's perfectly fine. It's you driving the city limos, as it were. But there's no reason to think that Maduro is particularly well suited to leading a major Latin American country. Although he's proven to be a reasonably competent dictator with a lot of Cuban help. Suffice it to say that all of this results in total economic catastrophe. And I believe that the GDP per capita for Venezuelans between the years, I think 2013 and 2023 collapses by about 2/3. So we go from like solid middle income country, $15,000 to $20,000 a head, like really not bad by Latin American standards.
One of the more prosperous countries in the region, my understanding. Yeah.
Yeah. And we're tanking all the way down to $6,000 to $7,000 and even below that. Like people are actually starving. And so 8 million people leave the country.
It's a crazy number of people.
Yeah, out of 32 million. It's like 8 million of them are abroad. And when you talk about like this type of failed state disaster, it's up there. It's like probably top 5. It's up there with Syria, which
Syria is the only other case that comes to mind in terms of that percentage of the population fleeing.
Yeah, I think there may be other examples. Like people would probably flee Zimbabwe if they could. Haiti would be another one. North Korea, you can't leave.
Correct. But just
right?
a quarter of the, I mean, to put that in American terms, that's like 85 million people, something like that.
Yeah. So, all of a sudden housing's a lot more affordable.
Yeah. Like twice the population of California just leaving.
So all the people that would resist the Maduro regime basically give up and leave. There is still a Venezuelan opposition, a democratic opposition. Some of them are abroad, some of them are in hiding within Venezuela. During the first Trump administration, there was this guy, Juan Guaido, who everybody had really high hopes in the Western world. He was this sort of charismatic democratic opposition leader, right? Trump didn't think much of him and actually called him the Venezuelan Beto O'Rourke, which I thought was hilarious.
It's a tough burn, man.
If you know anything about Beto O'Rourke, he's a guy who looks really good on TV, but pretty ineffectual. Same with Juan Guaido, but we both heard that and thought it was actually a pretty tough razz.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, that wasn't my reaction.
Yeah. It's like, say what you will about Trump. Some of his insults are just
Yeah,
like,
some of his insults are kind of funny.
anyway, Meatball Ron being another good one, I think. That brings us up to present day. So Venezuela is a basket case, but it's a basket case that's really dominated by the Maduro regime. It is an absolute autocracy. And in terms of like what type of regime we're talking about, it's somewhere in between Russia and Iran, I would say. So it's pretty standard. It's not a theocracy, but it is the case that he maintains a tight grip on power through collusion with the military. So I think, more than half of the government ministries are actually staffed by generals or former generals. The
That
military
seems to be the key to his staying power because
correct.
he's not a popular guy politically, but he's got plenty of police forces and the armed forces with him.
There's a lot of repression, and there has been for a long time. There was a democratic election last summer, in summer of 2024. It was like really blatantly cooked by the Maduro regime. Like the opposition apparently took some of the ballots, the actual ballots that were marked at these polling stations, and counted them. And the opposition figure won 80%. But Maduro declared victory and like sent the army into the streets, and that was
and I'll just say, like, one of the reasons I mentioned researching Woodrow Wilson's policies toward Mexico was his shift in how he extended diplomatic recognition to countries and thinking the US might be an outlier when it came to Venezuela. Not really the case. There's a very large number of countries and the European Parliament who all say that the 2024 election was illegitimate and have not recognized Maduro's victory. So a case where the US is very much not alone.
Yeah, not even close. However, Maduro is also not alone. So he has support from the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians, and of course the Cubans. Cuba being just north of Venezuela in the Caribbean. And all four of those countries cooperate with and sustain the Maduro regime in different ways. The Russians basically have conducted military exercises in Venezuela. They had, I think, International Army Day there a year or two ago. So like full-on military exercises on the territory of Venezuela. The United States didn't like this. They have also opened ammunition factories in Venezuela, which is kind of interesting. It makes it harder to invade Venezuela, as you'd imagine. Meanwhile, the Chinese are sort of the buyers of last resort for sanctioned Venezuelan oil production. They do this with Russia too, obviously. And they're a little bit more indirect in their support, but they're still very much supporting the Maduro
Do you know
regime.
if they're like they were with Russia? Are they getting the oil at discounted prices?
I would almost, guarantee it. I don't know for sure, but that must be the case because it's like, where else is the oil going to go, right?
Yeah, okay.
There's not a lot of options, but one of those options is China, and they do buy oil from whoever, whenever.
Yep.
That's Chinese policy. And yes, it's always at an advantage for China. No question about that. The Iranians, meanwhile, apparently cooperate with the Maduro regime on sanctions evasion, sanctions busting, and drone production. So it's kind of the stuff that they're good at when it comes to comparative advantages,
I also just want to this is a point you made last week about Khomeini's revolution in Iran. I outlined the long history of U.S. involvement in the region, obviously some of which was pretty unsavory stuff. I was expecting there to be more on the sort of legitimate grievance side, and I'm not saying there aren't on the Venezuelan side. I mentioned a few of them already, but
Hmm.
it really does seem to be a case where one guy coming to power flips things pretty dramatically. From the outset, Chavez is pretty outspoken anti-US guy. I think at one point he called George W. Bush the devil.
Hmm.
Um, I remember it was one of the first things I remember about the Obama presidency is they met early in 2009. He like gave Obama a book. It's like,
Mm.
read this. It's all about how terrible your country has been in the
Thank
area.
you so much.
And I think Obama said something like, yeah, I was like 6 when this was published or something like that.
Hilarious.
Um, yeah. And then the other part that seemed, which maybe you'll talk about a little bit, that seems interesting is the economic relationship did remain at least somewhat intact. Like I
Hmm.
think US remained Venezuela's largest trading partner for a good period of time and continues to import even to this day some Venezuelan oil. But it did seem like things flipped pretty quickly with the election of one guy.
Yeah, one guy, and he basically set about dismantling democracy. And to be clear, as you've already told us, Galen, the United States has not always been super consistent about promoting democracy as such
Correct.
in Latin America. But they really didn't like this guy Chavez. Chavez didn't like them. They saw in him sort of a new Fidel Castro type
Yeah.
guy.
And he was friends with Castro, which
Yep.
if you want to piss off the United States, that's a proven method for doing so.
Yeah, that's a number one in Latin America. Yeah, that's pretty much automatic, slam dunk. And Maduro has done nothing to transform that trajectory. He's just,
No, I
gone
mean,
the same direction.
one statistic, you mentioned hyperinflation, major debt, all of these,
Oh yeah.
devastating economic issues. One statistic I saw was that in 2020, annual GDP growth had reached negative 30%. I believe it's now positive again today.
From a
Uh,
low base.
Not massively, yeah, but like that is an absurd number. I
And
mean,
that's after 5 years of collapse, right?
yeah,
It's like you've already been free falling for 5 years. And it's like, yeah, okay, it's rebounding now, but that's what we call the dead cat bounce. It's like
yeah.
you throw well, cats landed on their feet, so but you throw it off the roof and you fall 10 stories.
I wish that honestly.
They may not survive, but
I mean, one other thing just to like throw a little academic jargon is, this is a case you could argue of so-called Dutch disease, which
oh yeah.
rather than get super technical about it, basically means overdependence on one natural resource endowment. I
Hmm.
think it stems from when natural gas was discovered in the Netherlands in the
Hmm.
60s or 70s. Um, but this is a classic case of just
Yeah.
complete over reliance on a single natural resource. And as you said, when the price of oil collapsed in 2014, I mean, I'd be remiss in not mentioning when I drove cross country in 2008 and was like, cool, I'll never have money for the rest of my life from spending money on gas. And I think it would have cost like less than half what it cost 6 years later. These are the types of boom and bust cycles you leave yourself open to when you're that dependent on oil prices staying high.
Yeah, and look, there's things you can do to cushion yourself against that. You can save for a rainy day, and some countries are much better at this than others. The major Middle Eastern oil producers all have sovereign wealth funds. The Russians built up a gigantic reserve
Yeah.
of like hard currency and foreign currency before they started the war in Ukraine, anticipating that they would be sanctioned and unable to sell their oil. Venezuela didn't do any of that. They just spent like drunken sailors, and everybody got free stuff for a while until they couldn't do that anymore. Then they all started to unfortunately starve and leave the
Yeah.
country. So
All right. Before we get into some of the details of the current confrontation, like the other thing I found interesting, I'd like to hear you talk about is
mm,
some of these Venezuelan expats and how the Venezuelan political opposition views U.S. involvement at the moment, because I actually found that pretty interesting.
yeah, it's complicated. So first of all, we know that 8 million Venezuelans fled abroad. Most of them ended up elsewhere in Latin America, especially in Colombia and Brazil, from what I can tell. But plenty of them also ended up in the United States. There's a big Venezuelan refugee community that joined a Venezuelan expat community throughout the country, but especially in electorally important states like Florida in particular. Now, I think that during the Biden administration, these people were accorded refugee status. Trump, too, we know what's happened to those refugee statuses. They've mostly been revoked. And Trump has accused, in particular, the Venezuelan expat community of being gang members. That's the pretext on which they're being rounded up and deported. And in fact, there are some gang members in the United States from Venezuela. The main transnational Venezuelan gang is called Tren de Aragua, I think. Yeah. So these guys are pretty nasty, from what I can tell. They're transnational criminals. They're a cartel. They do drug smuggling. They do people smuggling, assassinations, you name it, cartel stuff, right? So there's them. Then there's just normal Venezuelan people who want to escape Venezuela because they don't want to live under autocracy and starve to death. Fair enough. And then there's the Democratic opposition leadership.
Can I jump in on one point quickly on the second group you named, which is like one theory for why Trump seems to be interested in escalating with the Maduro regime right now is to force him to readmit Venezuelan exiles.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the reason for that is, as you were just saying, not all Venezuelan expats are members of drug trafficking or gangs.
The vast majority are not.
Correct. And so I believe right now, this was a few months ago, but Trump invoked the Alien Enemies Act.
Ah, yes.
To justify, which I think is from the 18th century.
Correct. 1798.
1798. To just the Adams administration.
An oldie but goodie.
To justify deporting essentially whoever he wanted to on the grounds that they were, affiliated with gangs or terrorist organizations. And
yes.
Those deportations are currently held up in court.
Yes.
And so one theory as to why he's doing this is to force Maduro to basically readmit large numbers of these individuals. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Another reason is that the Venezuelan opposition would like Maduro to go for obvious reasons. And the Venezuelan opposition has some political power in the United States with the Venezuelan expat community, who are capable of voting, the, Venezuelan American citizens, who again are somewhat electorally important, not unlike Cuban Americans. This also factors into our head of national security and Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who is himself Cuban American and might be at least partially driving the bus on some of this policy, we think.
Based on, now it's hard to say since he's like really done whatever Trump wants him to.
Yes.
After being labeled Little Marco back in 2016.
Yes.
But traditionally Rubio, sort of a neocon, highly interventionist kind of guy. So that would make sense. But, I should just say this is not unique. I didn't know about this particular case, but it is not necessarily unusual for expats in the United States to feel a certain way about their country of origin and to
not at all
government to do something about it. I found it equally interesting that the Venezuelan political opposition is very much like supporting at the moment. Maria Corina Machado is the head of the opposition. She sort of praised this naval deployment we talked about at the top and wants the United States to do more to embargo Venezuelan oil by revoking Chevron's licenses to import it to the United States. So that's not unique to this case either, but it's an interesting synergy between Venezuelans living in the United States and the political opposition in the country itself.
Right. Yeah, it kind of mirrors what happened prior to the Bay of Pigs.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
During the Cold War, that was the ill-fated arming and transport of Cuban expats, anti-Castro expats to Cuba to try to overthrow Castro during the Kennedy administration. Didn't go so well. No, didn't go so well. I don't think that's in the offing this time. And like I said at the top, 2,200 Marines is not going to cut it to conduct a regime change operation. And
like you said, I don't think that's what it's about. If for no other reason, I think his America First constituency would lose their shit if the U.S. got into a major war with Venezuela. I'm sure we'll get to why he's doing this, but I agree with you. I don't think an invasion is in the offing.
Yeah. So let's go there right now. I feel like we've set the table.
Okay.
Why is the United States doing what it's doing with these like specific group of forces that it's selected, including nuclear attack submarines, which doesn't make a lot of sense against either Venezuela's national forces, which are fairly ramshackle, or transnational drug cartels?
Yeah, I will throw out a laundry list of possibilities and then maybe we can
Mhm.
discuss which ones seem to make the most sense. So, look, I suppose possibly it is for the stated reason, which is, and they're just overdoing it in terms of the force needed, but it is to intercept drug trafficking and prevent things like fentanyl getting to the United States. I think I saw somewhere that a quarter of the world's cocaine passes
Mhm.
through Venezuela.
It is legitimately a transnational drug hub, and the Maduro regime is legitimately involved in transnational drug trafficking. Maduro himself has a $50 million price on his head.
Which, by the way, I was stunned to read is twice what the bounty on Osama bin Laden's head was.
Yeah, well, I mean, like part of that's inflation, right? But
Sure. But, but still, to capture, I mean, albeit in unrecognized, but another country's head of state for a $50 million bounty.
yeah, and
Um,
it's especially weird because, as you said, we're still buying oil from them.
yeah.
Like bizarre, right?
Yeah. Like, I believe the bulk of their oil exports, something like $4 billion. Now, like, just to add a little nuance, you're right. The government there is legitimately involved in some of these activities, to my understanding. The degree to which is unclear to me. You know, the
Mhm.
administration is saying Maduro is a terrorist and the head of a drug cartel, and all of these gangs are state run.
That's
Uh,
another sort of interesting thing the administration has done. It has labeled cartels international terrorists,
yes.
and transnational terrorist groups, and which they are not. Frankly, there's a big difference between what a cartel does and what a transnational terror group like Al Qaeda does. But that allows him to recycle the legislation that is still in force from the war on terror and basically do whatever he wants.
Yeah, I mean, I think the legal grounds, both internationally and domestically, for doing that are pretty dubious. I
Yeah,
also think I think the Trump administration does not care.
not
And
at all.
I think, frankly, even if that is the case and my legal analysis, and I'm not a legal expert, are correct, I think there will be zero repercussions for it.
Yeah,
Um, so in that sense, it sort of doesn't matter.
I agree.
It could be to carry out some sort of precision decapitation strike and do regime change that way. I think that would
Hmm.
be very risky, and there would be a also, even if it worked, the consequences might not be great. But
Yeah,
that's a
that's
possibility.
as we've talked about in the past, vis-a-vis Iran in particular. That's extremely unpredictable what happens next. You could just get somebody worse than Maduro. You could get the best case scenario, which is like, ooh, we have elections, democratic government, bad guy's dead, right? You get somebody worse, or you could just get a civil war, which I think is
Yeah,
probably the most likely.
there's all sorts of bad things that could happen, and the likelihood of it working might, is
Who
arguably
knows? Yeah.
out, but that's a possibility. As I said, it might be to put pressure on Maduro to accept Venezuelan migrants back into the country. It might be to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, or
Mhm.
at least enforce US predominance in the area, since, as you mentioned, a lot of US adversaries are now actively involved and arguably helping prop up this government. In addition to his domestic repression, having friends like China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba is
Yeah.
important to Maduro staying in power. So, and it could be, a combination of or all of those things.
Yeah. So I think what you just said makes sense. And the telltale there is the nuclear attack submarines. Those are, shall we say, very large and very valuable assets that not a lot of countries have. Certainly the Venezuelans don't have anything like that. There's absolutely no reason to send them unless you are saying to Russia and China, stay out of the Caribbean, right?
Yeah.
Or else. Like that's a very, very obvious and pointed message. That's like No, that's great power stuff, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I think their reasons, you noted that Russia has some military interests there. I think China
Hmm.
predominantly has commercial interests. But I think all of these countries, to a certain extent, are doing this maybe partly for ideological reasons related to supporting a fellow autocrat, but even more so as kind of like a middle finger to the United States. Hey, you're always messing around in our neighborhoods. We can do the same thing. I think that's probably part of the calculation. The piece of this I still really don't understand how hard a line the administration took during Trump's first term and is now taking at this point. Comparisons to the maximum pressure campaign against Iran, taking their oil off the market and things like that. Why is the United States still allowing some American oil companies to import oil from Venezuela to the United States? Like, why? What is going on there? I don't understand it.
I don't know for sure. I could offer a few theories. One theory is that while the United States would really like the Maduro regime to go, they don't necessarily want it to implode. So keeping it weak but alive is better than having it just implode without something ready to replace it in a real way, because otherwise you might get a civil war, even more of a refugee crisis. It seems like everybody who's left who can leave already has, but hey, Syria went to 50%, right? So that might be another 8 million Venezuelans.
Which is, I mean, that's crazy, by the way.
It's crazy, and that could destabilize, Latin America, right?
All
So
right, let me ask you this. Like, if this were just about drug combating drug trafficking, is this what we would be seeing?
no,
No. Okay.
not a chance. So I also think that domestic politics is playing a huge role here. Two of the Trump administration's major platform planks in 2024 was getting rid of refugees, number one, and stopping the flow of drugs into the United States, the fentanyl crisis, number two. And, you know, regardless of what you think about the second Trump administration in terms of the substance of its policies, it would be hard to argue that it has not pursued them with maximum aggression.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And so this kills several birds with one stone, right? It kills the refugee bird, maybe. It kills the drug trafficking bird. I mean, when I say kills, it doesn't mean that it's actually effective, right? But he is being seen to do stuff
Yeah.
in service of satisfying his campaign promises. And to Trump, I think the appearance is just as important, if not more important, than the reality. Right? So a lot of this is political theater. Some of it has a substantive effect as well. He is certainly deporting a ton of people. He is certainly interdicting drugs and coming down on cartels.
Yeah. And from a great power political standpoint, I wonder too, I have to check this, but I seem to recall Kennedy saying something to the effect of when the Soviets established their partnership with Cuba, that anyone that knows about the Kennedy brothers and their operations, you mentioned the Bay of Pigs against Castro, obviously knows that it wasn't something that was celebrated, and there were many, many efforts to overthrow Castro.
Mm-hmm. Exploding cigars.
I seem to remember Kennedy saying something to the effect of well, now this is actually a strategic advantage in some ways, in the same way that Berlin is now exposed for us. Now we have a hostage in our neighborhood. In that sense, maybe this is a soft target for Trump to throw American power around as a message to Russia and China. Hey, we see what you're doing down there. Good luck trying to establish a foothold in our neighborhood.
Yeah.
Again, that's largely speculation, and the White House has played its cards pretty close to its chest on this one, but maybe that's part of what's going on too.
I think that's probably true because obviously the U.S. and in particular the Trump administration is involved in high stakes, high level negotiations with both Russia and China, and to a certain extent Iran. And negotiations are not just diplomats talking, right? There's many different forms of communication, up to and including military force. Yeah, we've all read Clausewitz, right?
Big stick diplomacy. It's
Yeah,
back.
exactly. War is the continuation of politics by other means. And that was true in Clausewitz's time, and it remains true today. So that's part of it. I like countervailing that though, like how much does Venezuela actually matter to Russia and China and Iran? I think not very much.
Yeah.
How much does it matter to the United States? More. So there's some asymmetry there. Yeah. But yeah, it's kind of an interesting point.
Yeah. I mean, so I guess we're at predictions time.
Let's do it. All right. Are we going to invade Venezuela? Are we going to bomb Venezuela?
I don't think either of those things is going to happen. I think this is kind of going to be like a slow burn effort to diplomatically isolate and economically punish the country and sort of try to coerce Maduro, either just punishment for punishment's sake, or an act of coercive diplomacy, which I suspect will not work.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think, there are people like Bob Pape, University of Chicago, economic sanctions don't work is his argument. I actually think sanctions can have an effect. I think some of the research on the Iran nuclear negotiations, while I don't think that was by any means the whole story and it wasn't like a silver bullet, I think it almost certainly affected Tehran's calculus. That was over something that did not involve regime change. The idea that you can coerce Maduro into stepping down or something like that, or even into, bringing about a popular uprising, unfortunately, they have the guns. So I think probably what's going to happen is largely what's been happening since whatever it was, 2018, which is kind of just a slow moving deadlock that leads to more pain and suffering in Venezuela. And I think that's probably where matters will stay for the foreseeable future until there's some sort of exogenous shock that changes the situation. What about you?
Yeah, I think that's most likely. I think something you said that is really interesting and important that we need to double click on is it could be just punishment for punishment's sake, or it could be coercion.
Yeah.
Right? Trump is notorious for conducting punishment for punishment's sake. And especially with tariffs and things like that. It's like, okay, well, what can we do to reverse this decision? Obviously you want something, right? With some of these countries like Canada or India or whatever, right? And the answer is just nothing. I'm just gonna kick you because it's fun.
Yeah, I've kind of given up trying to understand what his tactics or plans are. In some cases, I'm not sure they're there.
No, it's
you can't say he's not unpredictable.
Yeah, for sure. But when it comes to coercion, there is a really important part that makes it work or not work. So coercion is about forcing somebody to change their behavior, right? Forcing somebody to alter from the status quo. And the threat is actually two parts. One is, if you don't change, I'm going to hit you.
Yeah.
Two is, if you do change, I won't hit you. Both are important to make it work. If it's if you don't change, I'll hit you. If you do change, I'll hit you. Then it doesn't work.
Yeah. And this is, since we both spent time at the University of Chicago, this is one of those points that Pape stresses. He's talking about air power, but it's if what you're asking for is the thing that there's no chance the other side is going to give up, then
that also doesn't work.
Doesn't work.
Yeah. No.
And this is a criticism you see frequently of sanctions is typically they end up harming ordinary civilians and not the people you're targeting, i.e. the government officials.
Yeah.
In this case, it sounds like Venezuelans would have been suffering economically regardless because of the government's incompetence and graft and corruption. But yeah, this is why I kind of don't think this is going to end anytime soon. The one thing that gives me pause is just your description of the military analysis at the time. Like, this is so much force being projected into this area to achieve goals where you absolutely do not need that much force. So there's
Yeah.
something else that's going on, and I'm not totally sure what it is, but I'm standing by my prediction.
Yeah, they do have enough there, it seems to me, to attempt a decapitation strike. They have like a lot of missile power in particular. They have cruise missiles and, tomahawks and subs that can launch missiles and like,
Yeah, and like we should say, like I take a lot of Trump's America First rhetoric actually seriously. And aside from the fact that there's a big constituency in his party that subscribes to that, I actually tend to think that is where he's legitimately at.
Mhm.
But he has shown, and in a weird way, he has some similarities here to Barack Obama, a willingness to use targeted force in limited ways. So I think his like first big military operation during his first term was targeting Syria after the use of chemical weapons. I think that was back in 2017. Obviously,
also Soleimani, right?
I was going to say Qasem Soleimani. He obviously just bombed Iran's Fordow site. So like, he's not opposed, or the Baghdadi operation, which led to the famous speech, he died like a dog. So like, he has shown himself willing to use targeted force in that manner. And so something like a decapitation strike, that's not my prediction, but that would be not totally out of step with his MO in the past.
Yeah, it's the idea that he can hit the target and then like the target's destroyed and they either can't or won't hit back. Right. It remains to be seen whether Iran will end up hitting back, by the way. That could be a slow burn and we could see something.
It could be a case of revenge is a dish best served cold.
Totally.
So,
yeah. Months or years later.
Yeah.
Right. We know that they've been trying to assassinate Trump. So
Correct.
there is that. But yeah, it's this idea of like a one-off. And then we just move past it and like now we can negotiate again. Right.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. It's an interesting way of doing business. And it's like, oh yeah, like let's go. Like I just blew up your stuff. So like now you've got, nothing to fight for. So now let's do a deal.
Yeah. I mean, look, like you could argue there's that it's a carrot and stick approach. Like look what he's doing in Eastern Europe right now. Right. Which is like, he clearly wants a deal.
Yes.
Putin for the moment is not willing to take that deal.
No.
So he, in the meantime, seems willing to back the Ukrainians. I think the Europeans are now providing cruise missiles to the Ukrainians that are from the United States. So like, it could be that sort of logic. I don't know enough to say how opposed he would be to dealing with Maduro or even what a deal would look like.
But like what he wants for Maduro, right? Maduro has a huge price on his head at the moment.
Yeah, but he seemed open prior to the attacks in June. He seemed genuinely open to doing some sort of deal with the Iranians. Now, maybe that was all a smokescreen.
Yeah.
And I don't have the answer to that. In this case, it seems like he's been 100% anti-Maduro going back to his first term. So I don't know what that deal even looks like.
Me either. And Maduro probably doesn't either. So it's like, I would expect him to call it 4.5 million militia members.
It's such an absurd number.
So, wow. it's like grandmas and pensioners, and like 12-year-olds. They all get assault rifles. Like,
yeah.
Okay. Weird. All right. That's Venezuela. Should we?
Wait,
go ahead.
I did not read for this. Well, I'm reading something, but I'm not finished. But you did. Correct?
I did. So I told you last week that I would read a nonfiction book, and I did.
I love that.
I read Land Power by Michael Albertus, who's a professor of political science at the University of Chicago, one of our alma maters that we share. And so this is a book specifically about land distribution and land reform and land stealing, the opposite of land reform, land consolidation.
Very relevant for today.
Yes, in fact, Venezuela is one of his case studies. So I was like, oh, this is great. This actually fits together. So here's what I think about the book. He makes the argument that this is a major explanatory variable in the fate of countries, whether they prosper or turn into wretched autocracies, basically. It's like who gets the land, how it's allocated, who has property rights, and so on. I think the book is a pretty good history book. The case studies are pretty interesting. And he goes into like a lot of really interesting history, including of Palm Springs, California.
No way.
So the dispossession of the local tribes around Palm Springs and how that went down. And
Really?
like how they allocated the land from the railroads and like broke up the traditional lands of the tribes that lived there. It's Calientes. And in fact, I was in Palm Desert, I think last year, and I stayed right next to the casino there. So that was kind of interesting. And that's not the only case study. It's full of like really well done case studies. So good history book. I do not think it's a very good political science book, frankly. I do not find his argument convincing that land distribution has independent causal power. I think land distribution is endogenous to other considerations. And he never really contends with that. What I mean by that is land distribution comes out of more fundamental causes having to do with, well, who was there before? What type of territory are we talking about? And other stuff like that, right? I think there's more fundamental factors. So yeah, I don't buy the theory, but I think it's still a good book for the history.
I might check that out. I mean,
Yeah.
the case studies sound pretty fascinating.
Yeah, and you see this a lot, by the way, in comparative politics.
Sure.
It's maybe there are some academic papers that the book came out of where he makes a more compelling causal argument with like paired cases or quasi-experimental stuff. It occurs to me that he could have used the way that they broke up the railroad land as a kind of quasi-experiment because when the government gave land to the railroads, they did it in a checkerboard pattern. So basically randomly distributed. And you could,
why?
I have no idea. I don't know. And you'd have to know, right?
Yeah.
But it was effectively randomly distributed. And some of these squares hit indigenous people's land and some of them didn't. So you could do like a partial randomization or quasi-experimental setup there. Maybe he did a paper on that. I have no idea. But like that's the type of setup that you need to make a political science argument.
Okay. That's interesting. Well, look, I'll give you credit. I did, frankly, more watching of classic movies this week than reading. So
any good ones?
I mean, look, man, I'm a little embarrassed to say I hadn't seen any of these. I don't know if you listened to Bill Simmons' podcast, The Rewatchables. But
I love the rewatchables.
Well,
yeah.
I had never seen Heat.
Oh, dude.
I know, and it was why it's like it was as advertised, and
one of the best movies ever.
The part where they're always making fun of where Pacino's like, "Give me all you got." I was laughing my ass off. I'm like, this is the best overacting I've ever seen.
Yeah, the diner scene between him and De Niro.
That's a classic. I hadn't seen Magnolia, which a couple of LA movies, and then I watched 12 Angry Men last night, the remake, and that was awesome.
Yeah, these are good ones.
Yeah, hadn't seen any of them, so I was about 30 years late to the party on a few of them.
On the other hand, you're in a position to really appreciate it.
Totally.
Yeah, so that's good stuff.
Yeah,
cool. And you'll be back, I'm sure, with one or several books for Book Corner next week.
I've got next week. I'm good to go, man.
Oh, fantastic. All right, we're gonna leave it there. Venezuela. Thanks everybody for listening. Oh, another thing, I never say this, but I should start saying it. If you like what we do, like and subscribe. It'll help us, and share.
We're now those guys. All right.
Yeah, no, we are those guys. Like we've been doing this for like 6 or 7 months, and I've never actually said that. Just like I should probably start saying that. I should probably start saying it like at the beginning of the podcast instead of the end.
We did not go to grad school in marketing.
No, not exactly. Awesome. Well, this was fun as per usual, and we'll see you guys next week. Yeah.